A 9-year-old girl left her home on an ordinary afternoon to sell candy in her own neighborhood. She never came back. But the most disturbing part of this story was not just the disappearance. Not even what they found days later, it was what took more than 60 years to be discovered. That afternoon, Candy Rogers did something that thousands of children did at that time. She went door to door, with a smile on her face, carrying small boxes of candy, trusting that she was safe. She knew those streets. She knew those houses. And she believed that nothing bad could happen there. But at some point between one house and another, everything changed. No screams, no witnesses. No immediate sign of danger, only silence. Hours later, her mother began to wait. Then to worry. And then to realize something that no mother is ever prepared to accept. Her daughter would not come home. What began as a simple delay quickly turned into a desperate search that mobilized an entire city. Hundreds of people and helicopters flying over the sky, and a tragic accident during the search that left people dead, as if that story carried something even darker. Days later, a small detail was found, and it would change everything. But the full truth, that would only come decades later. And when it finally came to light, it revealed something that no one ever suspected. If you like real stories that seem impossible to believe, subscribe to the channel. Because this story does not end the way you imagine. On Friday, March 6, 1959, in the city of Spokane, in the state of Washington, Candy returned from school as she did every day, entering her home with the calm lightness of someone who still lived in the innocence of childhood, with no sign that this would be the last ordinary day of her life. She had simple plans. She wanted to enjoy the weekend, maybe play with her friends the next day, think about small things, typical of a 9-year-old child. But before that, there was something she wanted to do. The girls in the group she belonged to were raising funds, and each one had the responsibility of selling a few boxes of peppermint candy around the neighborhood. Candy was part of the Bluebirds, a division for girls her age within the Camp Fire group, which at the time functioned as a kind of female version of the Scouts, where they learned responsibility, coexistence, and trust. Candy took that seriously. And that day, she picked up her 7 boxes, held them carefully, and went to her mother to ask for permission to go out. It was something common, she had done it before. And as always, her mother simply repeated what she always said. Do not take too long. Come back before it gets dark. It was a simple rule, and Candy always obeyed. If that mother had known that that day would be different, she would never have let her daughter walk out the door. But at that moment, everything seemed too normal to raise any concern. Candy ate something quickly, spent a few minutes with the dog, and then left. It was around 4 in the afternoon. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet. Other children were in the streets. Other girls were also selling candy door to door. And Candy blended into that scene as just another child living an ordinary day. She walked through the streets she knew, knocked on doors politely, spoke to strangers with the confidence of someone who had never learned to be afraid. And it was exactly that confidence that made her vulnerable. At some point that afternoon, between one house and another, Candy disappeared. At first, no one noticed. The neighborhood remained the same, the houses open, people coming and going, the routine continuing as it always had. Candy was just another child walking through the streets, with her boxes in her hands and a subtle smile on her face. But time began to pass, and inside the house, something began to change. Her mother looked at the clock. Once, then again, and then once more. Candy should have been back already. At first, it seemed like just a small delay. Maybe she had stopped to talk to someone. Maybe she was finishing selling her last boxes. Maybe she had met a friend along the way. But the minutes kept passing, and that delay began to feel strange. The house was silent, too silent. And there is a moment every mother knows, that instant when worry stops being just a thought and becomes a certainty. Something was not right. By late afternoon, the waiting was no longer calm. It was restless, it was distressing. She began to look out the window more often, hoping to see her daughter coming down the street, hoping to hear the sound of footsteps or the simple opening of the door. But nothing was happening. Time kept moving. And the sky began to darken. It was at that moment that concern stopped being silent and found a voice. Family members were notified, neighbors began to be called, and little by little, a small group began to form, walking through the streets, asking, searching, trying to find any sign of where Candy could be. Some people said they had seen her earlier, with the boxes in her hands, following her route, but no one could say where she was now. And as night fell, a certainty began to form. Candy was not just late, she was missing. From that moment on, everything changed. What had once been just a small searching group quickly turned into a desperate search. Family, neighbors, and friends began to walk the streets with more urgency, calling Candy's name, looking in every corner, every yard, every place where a child might be. Her name echoed through the neighborhood, but there was no answer. Candy's grandfather joined the search, accompanied by other people, walking through the streets already with little light, trying to find any sign, any clue that could lead to her. At one point, while crossing one of the streets, they were almost hit by a speeding car. It was quick, scary. But even shaken, no one stopped. Because, at that point, nothing was more important than finding Candy. Time kept passing, and the situation was becoming more and more serious. Authorities were notified, police arrived, and what had once been a neighborhood search turned into an investigation. The area began to be searched more carefully. Every detail mattered. Every piece of information was taken into consideration. And then, around nightfall, something was found. Some peppermint candy boxes, scattered, abandoned on the ground. They were similar to the ones Candy was selling, 6 boxes. But there was a detail. She had left home with 7. That did not seem like a coincidence. It did not seem like something a child would leave behind voluntarily. It was the first real sign that something had gone wrong. Very wrong. The searches continued that night, but there was nothing else. No trace, no answers. And as the city began to understand what was happening, Mother, alone at home, faced the worst night of her life. Without sleep, without answers, just waiting. And fearing the worst. The next morning, the city was no longer the same. The news had spread. And now, it was no longer just a family searching for answers. It was an entire community mobilized. Hundreds of people gathered, volunteers, neighbors, strangers, all united by a single goal: finding Candy. The search expanded rapidly. Streets, fields, open areas, stretches of forest. Everything began to be carefully checked. Groups were organized. Teams were divided. Every piece of land was examined with care. No one wanted to believe the worst. But no one could ignore the possibility either. The mobilization grew even stronger when official teams began to help. Local authorities, specialized units, and even aerial support were called in. A helicopter flew over the region, observing from above, trying to find any sign, any movement, any clue that could indicate where Candy was. Hope still existed, even if it was beginning to weaken. But then, something unexpected happened. During one of the search operations, the helicopter assisting in the search collided with high-voltage power lines. It was an instant, no time to react. The aircraft lost control and crashed. The impact was violent. And in that moment, the search for a missing child also turned into a new tragedy. Lives were lost. Men who were there to help would not return home. The silence that already surrounded that story became even heavier. Even so, no one stepped back. Because at that point there was something greater than fear. The need to find Candy, to give an answer. To not let everything be in vain. But despite all efforts, Candy remained missing. Days passed, and with time, hope began to change shape. It was no longer that quiet certainty that Candy would come home at any moment. It became something more fragile, more distant. But it still existed. Until, on March 21st, 1959, about 2 weeks after the disappearance, something was found. 2 men who were in a wooded area hunting marmots, several miles from Candy's home, noticed a small detail on the ground. A pair of shoes, small, delicate, clearly belonging to a child. It did not make sense in that place, and in that instant, a bad feeling took hold of them. The shoes were taken to the authorities, and when they were shown to the family, Recognition came almost immediately. And with it, fear took shape. On the morning of March 22, 1959, a new search was launched. This time, focused exactly on the area where the shoes had been found. Teams moved carefully, in silence. As if, deep down, everyone already knew they were about to find something no one wanted to see. And then, they found it. Among the vegetation, partially hidden, was Candy's body. Time seemed to stop in that moment, for those who were there, for those who were waiting for answers. And especially for a mother who, somewhere, was still holding on to the hope of holding her daughter again. The confirmation came, and with it, a pain impossible to describe. The search was over, but the story was far from over. Because now, there was a new question. Who did this? At the time of the crime, investigators found a detail that, years later, would become crucial. On her clothes, there was preserved genetic material, as well as a small purple stain that was analyzed and identified as grape chewing gum. At that moment, it seemed like just another strange detail at the scene. Something curious, but without practical use. Because in 1959, science still had no way to turn that kind of evidence into a concrete answer. DNA, as an investigative tool, simply did not exist. And so, what could have revealed the truth ended up being stored, forgotten for years, as a silent clue, waiting quietly for a time when, finally, it could be understood, while, outside, life moved on. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and little by little the case began to enter a phase that no family is ever prepared to face. The lack of answers. Still in 1959, investigators continued working, following leads, questioning people, trying to find any connection that could lead to the person responsible. But none of those attempts led to anything concrete. Time kept moving, and with it the feeling that the truth was becoming more and more distant. For Candy's family, life never went back to normal. The house remained the same, the objects stayed in the same places. But something essential was gone. The silence was now constant, and the absence impossible to ignore. The years began to pass. And with each new year, the hope for justice became harder and harder to sustain. But in 1961, something changed and a name began to appear within the investigation. Hugh Morse. He was arrested that year, charged with several violent crimes committed across different states since the early 1950s, crimes that already placed him on law enforcement's radar long before Candy's case. And little by little, investigators began to see possible connections. Morse had been linked to crimes in the city of Spokane around 1959, exactly the same period when Candy disappeared. But there was a detail that, to many, seemed disturbingly specific. He had a habit of chewing grape gum. An unusual behavior, but one that drew attention because a similar substance had been found on Candy's clothes on the day her body was discovered. To investigators at the time, that seemed like more than a coincidence. It was a possibility, a direction. Morse was interrogated. Questioned about the case, pressed, but he denied any involvement in Candy's death. Curiously, during the interrogations, he admitted participation in other crimes in the region, but never took responsibility for that one. And without a direct confession, without concrete evidence placing him at the scene of the crime, the investigation could not move forward. Still, his name remained for years. Decades, even. For many, Hugh Morse was the main suspect. The closest face to an answer, even without confirmation. And while the investigation remained stuck on that possibility, perhaps the true perpetrator remained unknown. Free for years, without ever being identified. And it was in this scenario of doubts, of incomplete answers and of a pain that found no end, that in June 1963, tragedy struck the family once again. Candy's father, unable to bear the loss of his daughter and the weight of not knowing what had truly happened, ended up taking his own life. That family, which had already been destroyed once, was struck again. And even after all of that, the answers still did not exist. That family, which had already been destroyed once, suffered again. And even so, the case remained unsolved. The investigations continued, but without clear direction. Suspects were analyzed, some seemed promising, but all of them were eventually ruled out. And little by little, what had begun as an intense search began to turn into something many already knew well. A closed case, a mystery without answers. As the years passed, Candy's case began to fade from the memory of many. The city of Spokane moved on. New stories emerged. New routines replaced what once mobilized everyone. But for those who remained, time never moved the same way. Candy's mother continued living in the same house for many years. The same place, the same walls, the same rooms, but now filled with a silence that had not existed before. She carried on as best she could, but there was something that never changed, the waiting. Even without saying it out loud, there was always that question. What really happened that day? Who did that to her daughter? The decades moved forward, and over time, the answers seemed further and further away. But the evidence remained stored and carefully preserved. As if, at some point in the future, someone could look at it in a different way and find something that no one had been able to see before. In 2001, more than 40 years after the crime, something began to change. Advances in forensic science opened new possibilities. Candy's clothes, which had been carefully preserved since 1959, were analyzed again. For the first time, something concrete emerged. A genetic profile. It was small, limited, but it was real. It was a direct connection to the person who had been there. Hope returned, even if cautiously. For many, that would finally be the moment when Hugh Morse would be confirmed as responsible, the outcome that seemed to make sense after so many years of suspicion. But the reality was different. When the genetic profile was compared, there was no match. And for the first time, it became clear that, despite everything that had been believed, he was not responsible. He could be many things, but he was not the one who had taken Candy's life. For investigators, that was a hard blow. Decades looking in the wrong direction. Decades believing they were close to an answer. But even in the face of frustration, they did not stop. The genetic profile was entered into national databases in the hope that, at some point, a match would appear and name. An identity, but time began to pass again. And once again, no answer appeared. It was as if the truth was still hidden. Waiting in silence for the right moment to be revealed, for a long time, it seemed that genetic profile would never lead anywhere, and as the years continued to pass, Candy's case remained without any concrete answer. 2005 arrived, then 2010, and even with all the advances in science, nothing seemed enough to reveal who was behind that crime. But science did not stop, and what once seemed impossible slowly began to become viable. Around 2017, a new technique began to gain ground within investigations, the so-called forensic genetic genealogy, a method that no longer depended on a direct match in criminal databases, but rather on building family connections, even distant ones. It was a completely different approach, more complex, but also much more powerful. And it could be exactly what that case needed. But only in 2021, more than 60 years after the crime, the Spokane Police Department decided to try again, this time using everything modern technology had to offer. The evidence was re-examined with extreme care, and the genetic material, already old and degraded over time, was sent to a specialized laboratory capable of working with samples that would previously have been considered unusable. It was a delicate attempt, perhaps the last. The scientists began the work with precision, analyzing each fragment, reconstructing as much as possible of that genetic profile that had remained silent for decades. And little by little, something began to emerge. A new profile, more complete, more detailed, and finally useful for a deeper investigation. Now, it was no longer just an isolated record and became a true starting point. With this new profile, specialists began to map family connections, build family trees, and cross-reference data that, for the first time, pointed to real people. And at that moment, after more than 6 decades, the case was no longer just a forgotten mystery and finally began to move toward a name. With the advancement of genetic analysis and the careful work of forensic genealogy, investigators were finally able to reduce the search field, no longer dealing with vague possibilities and beginning to work with a specific group of people. The investigation led to the same family, and within that family, 3 names began to draw attention. They were 3 brothers, men who, until then, had never been directly linked to the case, and who, for decades, had lived without any public suspicion related to Candy's death. At that moment, the investigation was no longer broad and became focused. Each one of them needed to be analyzed carefully. Life history, location at the time of the crime, behavior. Any detail could make a difference. Investigators began to reconstruct the past of those men, going back in time, trying to understand where each one was in March 1959 and whether any of them could have crossed paths with Candy that day. And it was during that analysis that something began to stand out. One of the brothers drew more attention than the others. There were details in his past that could not be ignored. He had lived in the same region where Candy lived. He was close. Close enough to know the streets, the routes, the neighborhood's routine. But it was not only proximity. There were also records of violent behavior years after the crime, including an attack against a woman, and a pattern that began to raise a disturbing possibility. Investigators could not state anything yet. But little by little, the pieces were starting to fit together. While the other names were being analyzed and gradually ruled out, one of them remained. And now, for the first time in more than 60 years, the investigation was no longer searching for a stranger. It was getting closer to someone real. Someone who had a name, a life, and a past that may never have been fully revealed. With the investigation becoming increasingly focused, investigators knew they were close, but something essential was still missing, the final confirmation that could turn that suspicion into certainty. Among the three brothers analyzed, one of them began to receive all the attention. His name was John Ray Hoff. He had lived in Spokane at the time of the crime, a few miles from Candy's home, and over the years he built a life that, from the outside, seemed ordinary. But there were details in his past that could not be ignored. Years after Candy's murder, he was involved in a violent attack against a woman, a crime that showed disturbing similarities involving aggression, attempted restraint, and a pattern that caught the attention of investigators. That was not proof, but it was a sign. And at that moment, all paths began to point to him. There was, however, a problem. John Ray Hoff was no longer alive. He had taken his own life decades earlier, in 1970. Perhaps the weight of guilt no one will ever know, and that made everything more difficult. Without a living suspect, there was no way to interrogate him. There was no way to confront him. There was no way to obtain answers directly. But there was still a path, the family. Investigators discovered that Hoff had a daughter, and they decided to contact her, explaining the nature of the investigation and the importance of cooperation at that moment. It was a delicate and difficult request, but necessary. The daughter agreed to help. She provided a DNA sample, and from that moment, the investigation entered its most decisive phase. The tests were conducted, the data was compared, and the result began to form. There was a clear genetic link between the material found at the crime scene and Hoff's family. But for investigators, there was still a final step. The final confirmation. With legal authorization, the body of John Ray Hoff was exhumed. A new DNA sample was collected, and then everything was compared once again. This time, without doubts and with no margin for error. The result confirmed what had remained hidden for decades. The DNA matched. After more than 60 years, the name had finally been revealed. The confirmation brought answers, but it did not bring full relief. After more than 6 decades, the name finally existed, the identity was no longer a mystery, and what had once been only a question now had a face, a story, a past. But there was something that could not be changed. John Ray Hoff was no longer alive. He had died in 1970, many years before any suspicion ever fell on him, and that meant there would be no arrest, no trial, and no moment so many families hope for, the moment when justice is finally served. And more than that, it meant living without complete answers, without understanding why. Without knowing what drove someone to commit such a brutal crime. Whether there was a motive, or if it was just a cold, inexplicable act. Those answers never came. Because Hoff took everything with him to the grave. For Candy's family, the truth came too late. Her mother was no longer alive to hear the name of the man responsible for her daughter's death. Her father had also passed away, carrying the weight of loss and unanswered questions. And that may be one of the hardest parts of this story, because even when the truth finally arrives, it is not always enough to bring peace. Still, there was something that could not be ignored. After more than 60 years, Candy was no longer just a memory without answers. Her story was heard, her pain was acknowledged, and the man responsible, even in absence, was no longer invisible. He finally had a name, and for many, that means something important. It means that time can hide the truth, delay justice, make everything feel lost. But it does not always erase what happened completely. And even after so much time, the truth still found a way back. Not in the way anyone had hoped, but enough to ensure that Candy's story would never be forgotten.